next item of business is to introduce our first speaker, and that is Mr. Shawn Darcy. Shawn is the Director of Market Research at National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and the title of his talk is Consumer Research, What They Say They Need and What They Want. And Shawn's background is as part of the market research team there at NCBA, helps to enhance a range of the beef checkoff funded work by bringing consumer insights into the equation when issues management, production, nutrition, quality, and communications work is being designed and implemented. Shawn has over 10 years of market research experience, having conducted hundreds of consumer studies. Topics have ranged from consumer perceptions regarding how food is raised, consumer segmentation, food preferences, food service and retail trends, new product opportunities, advertising evaluation, and messaging and brand insights. Previous to his experience at NCBA, Shawn worked for ComScore ARS, where he was an account manager of market research in the company's top pharmaceutical and consumer packaged goods accounts. Prior to his market research, he also spent time as assistant store manager at Kroger in Cincinnati division. And preceding his career at Kroger, he received his Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. Shawn loves living in Colorado, where he looks forward to spending time with his wife and 2 kids. Shawn, we're delighted to have you with us today, and I'll give you remote control here, and the bus is yours. We certainly, again, appreciate you joining us and look forward to your comments. I will remind our attendees, if you want to post up questions, please use the Q&A box to do that, and Shawn, I'll try and keep track of those as we go along and kind of help moderate those when we get to the end.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Happy to be here and talk through some normalcy here. So happy Tuesday to everybody. Looks like, here we go. So I'm here to talk to you about a lot of the consumer insights. And as was just mentioned, I work for NCBA on behalf of the Beef Checkoff. And really what we wanted to talk about today is we'll set the stage with consumer landscape and just overviewing what we're seeing. Before we dive into any specific topics, it's really just good to lay the groundwork on some general data that we see out there with consumers' natural behavior or typical behavior that they might have, even though these times maybe aren't as typical. And then the bulk of the time I really want to spend on, I'm calling it consumers in BQA or beef quality assurance. Some of that will be setting up just how they think about cattle in general and how they're raised, and then kind of dovetail into what they actually think about the beef quality assurance program and how we use that as a tool this fall to communicate with consumers for the first time ever. So we wanted to share some of that data that went into that work, and even some of the data from the campaign that we have to show the success that it did have. And obviously we don't want to ignore what's happening currently. So while I'll show you some of those upfront slides, we also want to show you some slides at the end here on some current data that we've collected at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, but also we've relied on some of our key partners that we work with. And just to give you an idea of what's happening in the current landscape and how things might be a little bit different currently. So let's get into that consumer landscape. I think it's first and foremost, how much are consumers eating beef? And how does that compare to the main proteins that we see? So what you're seeing on this slide, and this data is coming from you the last quarter or the first quarter of the 2020, so January to March 2020, you can see 71% of consumers are eating beef at least on a weekly basis or more. Now, when you compare that to chicken, it is lower. We have about 83% of people eating chicken. But that does drop off. It is ahead of what both pork and fish. And you can see we also do ask about meat alternatives. Now, I would say in this definition that we give them, a lot of people do lump in things like tofu. They're not just thinking of your Boca or your Beyond or Impossible Foods that may be replacing a burger patty, for instance. Another way to look at this, we've been collecting this consumer beef tracker, which I failed to mention was a group of people. We track every quarter 1,500 people that we balance to census. So we're able to step back and look at that on a regional basis. Now this data is from the last year aggregated together. And what you see is on average, we had people saying they eat beef about 67% of people eat it at least weekly. It's probably not a surprise, but the coastal areas on the West Coast and the East Coast are slightly lower than that average at about 65 and 66% respectively. And then the middle of the country is where we seem to skew higher with beef consumption. So that's just one of the trends we will keep track of. Another thing we ask is just how do you feel overall, about beef? When you think about the product, how it's raised, everything. And what you see on this slide is most people, nearly 70% in this quarter, felt positive about how beef was raised. Now, when you look over to the right, 81% of people feel positive about chicken and how chicken overall. But you can see a lot of people aren't necessarily negative. So we are lower than chicken, but it's still most people are coming from a positive or even a neutral kind of on the fence consumer or perspective, which is important for us to understand as the beef checkoff when we're thinking about promoting. Is not everyone, even though they might have a louder voice, is negative about beef. Another thing we're asking in this consumer beef tracker that we have is what do you consider when you make a meal choice? Now this is not specific to beef. This is when they're deciding on any meat protein, we ask them. But the top considerations that you're seeing is great tasting, fits my budget, good value, knowledge on how to prepare it, safe to eat. And then secondarily, you start to see on the far right here some health is a healthy choice aspects come up. Now, when we look at that from 2018 to 2019, we do not really see any dramatic shifts in what we've seen there. But what's interesting is on this next slide, when we look at these attributes and we look at things around production or how cattle are raised, things like raised responsibly, environmentally friendly, trust the people that raise the animals, supports causes, those are all higher than they were the previous year, most of those being statistically so compared to our 2018 year. Now, going back real quick, you can see these numbers are a lot higher. So there's more people considering in general that taste factor, the value, convenience, the safety of the product, even your health attributes. But we haven't seen growth like we have in the production area. So it's just something to keep in mind. We look at that in the beef checkoff and just realize that we do need to have some communications out there addressing these things because there are more people, more than ever, that are starting to think of these items along with things like taste and things like health. Another question we ask is, we try to get into the more aspirational and think about the future consumption and how that might differ for beef and chicken and so on. So one of the questions we ask is just thinking about the future. Do you plan to eat more or less, about the same amount of beef going forward? And what you can see in the top right corner here is that nearly 2/3 of people, so the bulk of everyone, is saying, I'm just going to eat the same amount. And if you remember back to the consumption slide, that's a really good number. So a lot of people are just going to continue eating that amount. We do have 12% of the population that says they plan to eat more in the future and 16% that say they are going to eat less. Now, if you look at those underlying reasons, you can see there's not a strong majority anywhere, but you do see that taste and grilling, especially as we come into the summer months, becoming those factors around eating more. And we have a lot of health and price-related ideas that top the list for reasons to eat less going forward. Now, we do also have things like trying to eat more plant-based protein. Now, mind you, that's 4% of the population that's saying that. And then you do have, even less than that, saying eating less beef is better for the environment moving forward. So those are part of the conversations, but they're not driving it. And then, the other thing I would say about this question is, it's something we want to keep track on and see how we might look at this data going forward, but it is very aspirational. An example of that is, we do ask about seafood. And I think 30% of people plan to eat more seafood, but we've never seen that number or that consumption over the last few years go up, even though that number has continued to be high. So transitioning a little bit, we also ask about how cattle are raised and the production process. And what you're seeing on this slide is that same scale, so a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being negative and 5 being strongly positive. But how do you feel about how cattle are raised? So you can see the biggest difference from that first slide I showed you, which was all those components of beef, is that positive number is down. It was close to 70%, and now it's 44% of people saying that they're positive about beef. But really, it's not a large jump in the negative with 20 to 25%, depending on the month and the protein being negative. It's really this on-the-fence consumer. So we have a big chunk of consumers that really don't have an opinion, or they're on the fence and haven't made up their mind on whether they're going to be positive and negative about how cattle are raised. And the other thing that we see is this is really in line with what we're seeing with other proteins. And we put chicken on this slide. And if you remember, again, back to one of those first slides I showed you, there was about a 12 percentage point gap or so from chicken to beef when you think of all the components like health and value and all of those things that go into this conversation. But in this case, we really are in line with one another. And a lot of times when we're talking production, or we're talking about these ideas, there's a strong halo or indirect impact across one another. Consumers are further away from food than they've ever been, and I'll show you a little bit more data on that. So when they're thinking about production and they hear a negative story or a positive story, they don't necessarily associate it with one direct area in agriculture. It's kind of spread across multiple areas. Another question we asked that we've been tracking back to is, we ask an unaided question on concern. So just thinking about how cattle are raised, are you concerned? And if so, what are you concerned with? And you can see about 62% of people mention a concern. Most of that's general, like I'm just concerned, not really sure, but I know it, I wanted to worry about this going forward. But what we can picture out of this is that most people are talking about the components of animal welfare. And we'll get into that more in our next section, but a lot of that's confinement, how they're treated, those sorts of things that people are thinking of top of mind. And there's not one other topic that even gets 10% of people aggregating together, talking about hormones or antibiotics. And in this case, we even tabled the environment in terms of concern. Doesn't mean they're not talking about it or they don't consider it. If you go back to those consideration slides, we had nearly 40% of people, or just over 40% of people in this quarter, considering the environment when they're making a meal choice, but they're not necessarily overly concerned right now or having a negative stance necessarily when it comes to beef. And what we've realized is if we give them a list to choose from and ask them what they're concerned about, they're going to be concerned about everything. But this unaided approach where we have them type in their responses really gives us a cleaner version of what they're really thinking about top of mind when they think of concerns. I mentioned this previously, but our knowledge is low. So we ask consumers, a very straightforward question, how familiar are you with how cattle are raised? And we have 27% of people that tell us that they're familiar with how cattle are raised. So 73% or over 7% every month and every quarter are telling us they really do not know how cattle are raised, and if so, it's very little. Now we're not testing them in any way. This is not like a college course. We're just asking a very simple question. So that number, watching and observing focus groups, I can tell you that is a lot higher than it probably is. Then it's probably not, but it's still a pretty low number. So it tells us that we want to continue to educate on these topics. And you saw those considerations go up year over year, and that is important. And if you look on the right side of this chart, we have 44% of people that are saying they often or always are considering how or where their food was grown and raised. And we also have 26% that are at least sometimes considering it. So again, it's part of that conversation and important to make sure we have communication out there on these topics. So I'm going to transition into the consumers and the beef quality assurance message that we mentioned. So this was about a year and a half ago we started this, and we started with a qualitative assessment in 3 regional cities across the country. We went to Seattle, Philadelphia, Denver, and hosted 9 focus groups. We do typically see some regional dynamics, so we wanted to make sure that we took into account all of those ideas, and then we followed it up with a quantitative study. And the point of these was just to understand how consumers felt about food in general, but then weave in the beef production story, and then understand how and if beef quality assurance could be a platform that we could use to help express to consumers how the industry is doing things the right way. And you'll see throughout, we've also did some evaluating of content that we've put forward, whether that's videos or still images that we had, and that was a part of this discussion as well, and we'll dive into some of that. So the first thing, and it goes back to just lack of awareness, is we ask people, and this is one of my favorite exercises we had the moderator do, is we had her ask, from cow to burger, from pasture to plate, what happens? And these were people we all recruited that were interested and knowledgeable about how cattle were raised. And the biggest thing they said was they didn't know, or there was just silence when we watched these focus groups. So we followed that up in the quant, and the same thing happened. So what you're seeing is a word cloud here of the typed in responses from our quantitative assessment with 1,000 consumers. And the biggest thing they said was, I don't know. And you see a couple verbatims here. I have no idea about the beef life cycle. I really have no clue whatsoever that goes into the beef life cycle. And then those that did try to put in a response, most of the time it was not accurate in nature. So that was one of our biggest learnings. And another thing is we gave people a scenario to pick, and one of them was the more typical life cycle. We had a grass-fed operation. Then we had 2 different confined operations. The cattle live in confinement their entire life inside and their entire life outside. And we had 43% of consumers tell us that they believe cattle are raised from the time they're born until slaughter in confinement their entire life. 20% of that being inside their entire life. We saw 2 main beliefs come out of this as well, of what they feel like is happening in the industry currently. One is they feel like the majority of the industry, or the larger part of the industry, is focused on money. It's large scale. This is where the inhumane treatment, the overuse of antibiotics, the crowded conditions, that is where this is happening. And this is what the most common state is right now of food production. But they also recognize that there are still small family-owned farms out there. This is where they believe is a dying breed. They associate it more with your niche markets, such as your organic, your grass-fed. But this is where they believe the higher quality and better conditions are happening. And you can see this verbatim from a consumer that we put on the slide. You can see documentaries, it's like a prison. They're all caged together. Just gives you just some of the things that we heard during this research. It actually just shows us that there's a large opportunity, obviously knowledge gap in the system, because a lot of things that they were associating with these smaller family farms within the niche markets, those were things that we know were true for the entire industry. One, it is mainly made up of family-owned farms, but 2, we know these conditions with beef quality assurance are good and that the animals are treated right. So it showed us an opportunity to talk about everything going on. So we introduced them to beef quality assurance, and we didn't really give them a ton of information. We introduced a 3 to 4 sentence intro on what the program was. And then we had 5 or 6 facts that we told them about the program as well. And then after we introduced this to consumers, we asked them if it increased their confidence that beef is safe, that the animals are treated humanely. And one thing we're always working on the beef checkoff is, does it represent the beef at their grocery store? So we can show, farmers and ranchers are seen as a credible source, and we can show a video on a local farm or ranch, and that's really going to resonate with consumers. But how do we make them believe that this is common in the industry? It's not the minority, and that it represents everyone out there. And that's what we're looking to do here. And we had 62% of people saying that they felt like BQA represented beef that they could find at their grocery store. So for us, that was a big win. And you can see 2/3 saying that they felt by knowing about beef quality assurance, the animals are treated safely, and that 70% it increased their confidence. So we created a video to help bring to life what was happening with beef quality assurance. It was our first consumer-facing piece that we had. And you can see here, this is the strongly negative to strongly positive question that you saw the pie charts with earlier. And as you remember, we had about 44% of people on a typical day that say that they are positive about how beef is raised. Well, after we showed them this video, that increased to 70% of people. So we had a 26-point jump of people saying they're positive about how beef is raised after they were exposed to the BQA program through this video. So it was, again, a telling sign that people want this information and it really can make a difference. At the same time, we heard real quick, especially in the focus groups, that there's varying levels of understanding and want or need for this information. For a lot of people, just knowing the program itself was there is enough. They're not really going to dig into a lot of the details. They're like, hey, beef quality assurance, it's great. I'm glad it's there. But then there are a smaller amount of people that do want to know that information. They want to know the details behind it. Heck, they might even want to know the 14 antibiotic judicious use guidelines, but most people don't want that. So we want to think through that when we're thinking about this campaign that we launched this last fall on how do we create the levels? How do we create a trail for people that do want to seek out more information, but not overshare information with people that really don't care as much about this conversation? So one of the things we did, and I alluded to one of those slides already with the shift in the positive and negative, is we went out and tested this final video that we ended up going out with. And one of the interesting things we can do, and I'll show you the results from it in a minute, is we have people use their mouse and they drag it from left to right where they're interested within the video. And we're able to aggregate that for all 1,000 people that we have or that went through and did this testing to see where are those places that consumers are maybe not as engaged and where are those places in the video that they are even more engaged. The biggest thing that came out of the exercise that we did is most people, and it's probably not a surprise because that's where their concerns were, is animal welfare. That people were really latching on and more engaged into those animal welfare scenes that were coming to life in this video. But there was some focus on the room they had to move, right way being the only way. That was kind of part of the slogan we used. And even the Beef It's What's for Dinner slogan, and using the nostalgia of the beef checkoff brand of Beef It's What's for Dinner. So this result is what you're actually seeing is the aggregated track for consumers as they watch this 30-second ad. So what's great about this is we're able to build interest through the entirety of the ad. And a lot of times you may see a dip, or if something's off-putting, you'll see that go down a little bit. And what's also interesting about this is at the end, when we have our kind of rodeo sign-off of the Beef It's What's for Dinner brand, we actually have a spike up. Now, normally when commercials end, we're losing interest with consumers. A lot of times you will see this start to dip down. It's just kind of the natural path of most advertising. But what we see here with our brand, and we've seen this on several occasions, is we do have a jump up in engagement at the end when we have this kind of nostalgic sign off that we've always had. So that is a great thing for our brand. But we also, going back to the layered approach, the way this was brought to life is, the big push behind this was that video that we tested. But then we also had a place that they could go and learn more about that. And that first layer was on the Beef It's What's for Dinner website. You can go to Beef Quality Assurance and learn more about the program there. And then if you really do want that information, that more technical detail, there was a place for you to be able to go to bqa.org and get that information. So we're being transparent, we're sharing that information, but we're not necessarily putting the bqa.org website on Facebook, on social media as our attention grabber. We're educating and kind of creating that trail for consumers. And it showed to be very successful. So it was introduced to consumers, non-producer audience in mid-October for the first time. And the whole point was to show how farmers and ranchers are committed to producing a safe and high-quality beef. And again, the idea was to help this feel-good story by highlighting the farmers and ranchers through BQA that they're raising beef safely, humanely, and sustainably. This is some of the reach and engagement metrics that we had when we first launched this campaign. There was over 11 million views of that video you just saw, over 58.6 million media impressions. We had 16 radio interviews with over 22 million consumers. You can see our MBA grads program that we have here was also involved. So there's a lot of positive things that came out of pushing this. And then the other thing we can do is the consumer beef tracker, from some of that data that I shared with you at the beginning, is we are able to track this. It's a continuous tracker. So we looked at metrics in our tracker to see if we were making movement with the resources that we're putting behind this campaign. And the one thing that you'd see is going back to that positives of beef question from the very beginning is in October and November when we were high on this with this campaign, we were able to move the needle to some of the highest levels that we have seen in our tracker. And then the same can be said for the positive productions or the positives of how cattle are raised. That number was the highest it's been yet at 43% in November. And on the counter measure, our low familiarity number went down even further during that time. So we were helping educate consumers on some of those metrics. Just a couple more to make that point is in October and November, environmentally friendly way. We could see an increase there as raised responsibly. We also had an increase. So across the board, a lot of these metrics that were the goal of this campaign saw an uptick while we were pushing this campaign out. And really through these months going into 2020, we've remained pretty high as well. And in December here, you saw a drop down. So overall, it seems like a very positive impact that this had on consumers. So let's spend some of the remaining time here talking about the current situation and how we've seen the conversation shift around some of these topics. So Directions Research is a company that we rely on heavily for a lot of work we do in-house, including our consumer beef tracker, but they're actually funding their own COVID dashboard. And what you're seeing here is just the overall concern level that people have around the situation, which you can see peaked in early April, but has started to, while it still does remain high, I don't want to, 2/3 of people are still saying they're concerned, it has come down about 10 percentage points since then with a slow uptick. And I did actually, before this meeting, get to see this last week's data, and it was at 63%. So that number is continuing. And the green line here represents how many people are saying that their behavior has shifted extremely or very different. So once again, you had that peak in the beginning of April, but then it has trended down and continues to trend down as things begin to lift slightly across the country. And then the other one here you're seeing is just the likelihood to actually contract the virus. The majority of the people aren't necessarily thinking that they're at risk to be getting that, but you do see we had that peak in more early May, but that's continued to trail off as well. Another thing we're looking at, and we work with a company called IRI, which does retail scanner data, so all of the things that are being scanned out across your grocery stores. And there's a lot happening on this slide, but the red line here that you see is beef and what's happening with beef. And you can see a lot of these numbers are in the 20 to 40 to 60 percentage point area. And we have gone down, and I think this last week here, we were at about 26%. And again, while that's trending down, that number is still very high. On a typical year, last year when we were presenting the results for the entire year and we were talking about how beef had a great year, the number was just under a 2% gain. So now we're looking at gains that are 26% year over year and week over week. Those are really astronomical numbers still that we're seeing across the country. Now it has slowed since that initial push when everything happened at the end of March and even into early April. And then this blue line that looks like it's all over the place, because it is lamb. I wouldn't pay as much attention to that. Really, we just have the week of Easter was flipped this year compared to last year. So if you were to put those and kind of level that out and neutralize it, you would see that number just kind of going along on that same track. Similar when you look at restaurant transactions. It's no surprise to anyone with a lot of restaurants shutting down. There's been a lot less transaction. Full service restaurant, or FSR, had the biggest hit, which is probably not surprising. But as things have lifted and getting more, obviously more comfortable with takeout, but obviously more comfortable with some people going back into restaurants, those numbers are coming back. They're not there yet, but they are starting to show some promise. Another thing, we're doing several surveys and mini surveys and trackers here at NCBA as well to understand how the things might impact beef and where concerns might be. And one of the questions we ask is just overall, how concerned are people about food shortages? Now, when we get very direct with them and ask them that, we have nearly 2/3 of people saying that they are concerned that there could be food shortages. Where their biggest concerns are is probably not a surprise. It's more of your staples or common items in the house, eggs and milk. You can see chicken breast and ground beef also up there as well. And then steak a little bit further down the list, more in line with your pork and your seafood. Another thing we just want to know, and we want to continue to monitor, how are people being impacted? Obviously, we've moved this meeting online, and you can see most people are working from home, or a lot of people are. Really, there's only about 3/4 of the people are saying they've been impacted in some way. Only about 1/4 of people are saying they've been impacted in no way. But there are a lot of people that get impacted in a variety of ways, whether it's being laid off, furloughed, or having staggered shifts and working from home. So those dynamics continue to be out there. They continue to be at these levels. We've also seen spending habits shift. Now, this probably isn't too shocking. When you look down at the bottom first, you can see about a third of people, probably a little bit more, are spending more on essential things like groceries and sanitation, whereas your large item purchases and your money towards your savings, even some of the flexible spending, are the things that have been more put on hold recently. Yeah, and probably, again, not surprising, but the reasons they are changing is most people are talking about the virus specifically. You do have people just worried about the economy overall, and that's another reason they're being a little more cautious right now. So again, a lot of that behavior is going on. You know, another thing we're looking at is food safety. Are people concerned about it in their food, with handling of food? Where is that coming up? And one of the things that we saw is about 73% of people are saying they're more concerned or have a heightened concern during this COVID state when they're thinking about food safety. Now, when we actually look at what those concerns are, when they write in their responses, most people are not really, again, they're just saying they're generally more concerned. We do have about half of that group talking about food handling in particular. And the good news is they're not relating it to being in the food, which we were a little worried for a time there that may be the case, but it was only about 1 to 2% of consumers that actually said they thought the food itself could have it. It was more the employees' handling of it or the packaging it was in that they were more worried about. We're also continuing to monitor stocking up behavior. You know, I think with that IRI slide that we showed you on how retail sales have been trending, we have definitely seen an uptick in people stocking up on certain dynamics. And you can see about 60% of people are at least going to stock up a little more than they typically have. And that's been the trend since back in April. And they have between 1 and 4 weeks of food in their house. Now, there are about 20% of people that have more than 5 weeks of food, but there's really not many people that have less than a week right now. Just to be, you know, we're hearing from consumers, they're just being a little more cautious about how many times they might go to the store, or they might just find it inconvenient with all the processes that are in place. So people are doing more larger shops than those smaller shops that might become more frequent throughout a week. So what are they stocking up on? You can see most people have at least some meals of ground beef in their house, so that's the most common one. And almost over 30% of people have at least 5 meals worth. You can see over 20% of people have at least 5 meals worth of steak. Roast is a little bit lower, but there's still a lot of people that are stocking up on those as well. And another thing we're looking at here at the Beef Checkoff is just what can we do to entice people to continue to eat beef, whether that's the beef they have in their freezer or to entice them to go to the store and to continue to purchase it. And you know, a lot of what we're seeing is very simple ideas right now to help them be creative with what they might have, like quick and easy meal ideas, just general preparation ideas that they may not have thought of before. Obviously, anything around value, like retail promotions, is appreciated from consumers, but things like grilling recipes, ideas on how to use ground beef, using your common pantry items that you may have stocked up on, like what are some interesting recipes. So we're working on a lot of those things right now as well, but consumers definitely want to continue to eat beef. Another question we ask, and this is again more open-ended, we're not giving them this list to choose from, is we're just asking them, thinking about the next few months, are there any fears, worries, or concerns you might have about the beef industry? You can see for the most part, you know, 40% or so of people do not have a concern. 1 week we did have more of an uptick, where about 70% of people had a concern, but for the most part, a lot of people don't really have a concern, and the biggest one is more about being out of stock than it is than anything else. And that is starting to, that went up again in the end of May here, or in the beginning of May, and is coming back down now. You can also see prices have started to trend up a little bit as being a bit of a concern, and that's something we'll be paying attention to. We didn't have a lot of specific mentions around anything around worker safety or anything specific around the packing plants that we noticed that would be of any concern really at the consumer level. A lot of it was just general concern about not being able to find either the steak cut or the beef that they want, or the stores are limiting how many they may purchase, so they have to go to the store more often. Obviously, the online dynamic has also shifted with what we're seeing now. And 86% of consumers are saying that they currently order their meals online. Among those that they order, you can see a good chunk of people are ordering meals online, at least 46 or 39%. And this is specific to your food service area. And when we follow that up with, has it changed at all? You can see that most people, or half of people, are saying it has definitely increased during this time. And you can even see about 16% of people saying they just started doing some sort of online meal delivery service here. And we looked at those same numbers for online grocery shopping, and are people doing that? And what you're seeing is 2/3 of people are saying they currently are buying groceries online, most of that being more monthly, but then you also have your weekly shoppers. When we look at these type of people, most of them are younger than 45, but it's not everyone. We are seeing it across all age groups. They're middle to higher income, and they typically have kids in the household, so getting at that convenience and that time, or not being able to want to bring their kids into the store at that time. And once again, you see that over half of the people have said this has increased since this current COVID situation, and another 21% are saying they just started due to this. And a lot of people believe that this behavior will continue once this COVID situation is over. So I know I ran through a lot of data there. I'd love to leave some time for questions if we have any.
Great, thank you, Shawn. That was outstanding information, and we do have. I was monitoring our Q&A here, and we had a couple of questions pop up that you subsequently answered. So good job, sort of catching those as they came through. But one of the early questions, and again, attendees, we've got just a few minutes here. We can take a couple of questions for Shawn. But use the, if you would, the Q&A box, and we'll get those spooled up. But Yvonne asked here, how have you compared how consumers have changed over the years and decades, and have those percentages increased and decreased, relative to what the main concerns are? So I'm thinking, and you've got particularly some of the more recent data, you can see those trends. But if we think back to maybe the 1970s, what was the stuff that was important then some of the same stuff consumers are concerned about now?
Yeah, I think there's always macro trends that are shifting. I think a lot of our data is, unfortunately, we started a tracker in 2007, which I know I have hard, quantifiable data to, and that is, I'd say in about 2012, 2013 is where we started seeing the shift in more of the production-related conversation in terms of what's been happening recently, to the point when us as the Beef Checkoff, at first, we were not even concentrating on those topics in terms of being a concern and monitoring what the production levels and perceptions were, to having our own design survey. And now recently, when we rebooted our tracker, we've completely integrated them, because it's no longer two separate conversations. It's part of what people are thinking about when they make a meal choice. I think when you go back further, I think the biggest things that stick out is just how people have thought about health, and how that conversation has continued to evolve, sometimes in our favor, a lot of times not in our favor, when we had the fat trends, and then you have sugar trends, and now recently we have had some on our favor with protein and those sorts of things. That's been the biggest dynamic, but I think taste has always been our strongest equity, and people wanting to be able to rely on that. But I unfortunately don't have any of that macro level data going back further.
Great, thanks, Shawn. One of I guess the next question up here is, you had a slide where you discussed, what consumers are looking for in the future. And the question is share maybe a little bit about how you envision NCBA meeting some of those needs or helping producers meet some of those needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can tell you, one of the biggest ones that comes out in terms of reasons eating less is health related. And that's a constant pillar for us on what we communicate on. We work with influencer groups here at NCBA and bloggers and RDs that we're able to set up this conversation and educate consumers on that. From a mass promotion standpoint, we do that more at a high level in some of our content, whether that's on Facebook or Twitter or wherever that might be. And we communicate a lot on that protein message and really what's working well for us. You will also notice this winter we had a myths campaign that did go after a lot of the environmental myths that are out there. So that was a big promotion of ours, as well as things like beef quality assurance that we talked about did help mitigate that, even if we weren't directly talking about some of those environmental factors. And the other one that was on that list was meat alternatives. I can tell you that is a major thing that we are looking at and addressing in many different ways here. We have seen the more direct and we get with some of our call outs, it turns off consumers more than helps them with that message. We're seen as kind of the big man on campus, if you will, being beef. So if we get very direct with calling out a specific brand or an ingredient list even sometimes, then we doesn't go over as well. So we are out there, we're communicating that. We've had a lot more success communicating about beef's benefits and how great beef can be. But that was also part of a myth campaign that we had on this winter. It's going to be continued part of our efforts moving forward as well in a variety of ways.
Great, thanks, Shawn. Another couple of quick ones here. These have been great questions. One of them is, it said you mentioned that consumers wanted to know about programs like BQA, but not too much. Can you discuss a little more about what was the minimum that they wanted to hear? So maybe not overloading our consumers, but you're making sure we get adequate amount of information.
I think for a lot of people, it was knowing that the program exists was the big thing. Obviously, I've been producer facing before then. And then some high level information. And what we've seen in a variety of different things that we've tested is anytime consumers care about what's in it for me and what's in it for the animal. They want to know the animals are treated well, and they want to know that their food is safe. And so anytime we can reassure consumers about the safety and the animal welfare message and show that end benefit to the consumers, we're going to have a more successful message. So that's what we played up a lot with our beef quality assurance message, because honestly, those are the pillars behind beef quality assurance, is safety and quality and things that are the end benefit for consumers. So it was a very high level message, just letting them know that this program does exist. It's meant to educate producers, which they also liked, that it was a teaching program, in that we were able to share that it is for safety and animal welfare standards. We didn't get into a lot of really granular facts and details about the program. We certainly, we had some people in focus groups that would be like, I want to know it all. And then we'd show them the 14 judicial use guidelines and be like, yeah, I don't want to read this. This is way too much. So it was definitely not all that much information, but just showing them the layers and showing that they could link to BQA or could link to Beef It's What's for Dinner and get more information, a lot of times was enough as well, because they might not click on it, but if they wanted to, it's there.
Yeah. Sometimes just knowing that we've got a plan and that we care carries a lot of the water that we need carried.
Correct.
Yeah. Great. One last question here. This one actually came out of the chat box, and there's a couple, and we'll apologize in advance that we're not going to get to just out of the interest of time. But this one I think is a good one, and it says, is the educational video for consumers that you mentioned available somewhere?
Yes, it is. It's on Beef It's What's for Dinner under the Raising Beef section that we have. There's a beef quality assurance area there. I can also find a way to get that to you if you want to share it with
Super.
you.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind, Shawn, when we're done here with your little segment, just post that over in the chat box, just the URL for it, would you please?
Yes, not a problem.
That'd be great. Excellent. Well, Shawn, if we were all in person, we'd give you a rousing round of applause. I think great information here. And I think sometimes one of our challenges with as beef producers is not always do we see a lot of the work that's going on behind the scenes at the Beef Checkoff and NCBA and other state beef councils that are really working to promote our product, because most of that is faced much more towards consumers in the bigger metropolitan areas. And so this was great to learn about, the things that you guys are tracking and following and helping to promote the product that we produce every day. So thank you, Shawn.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the time.
The state of Iowa and Iowa State University are proud to host the 2021 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Research Symposium and Convention. The convention will be located in downtown Des Moines with easy access to the airport, hotels, and local restaurants. Iowa State University is just north with its research and teaching farms. Join us in Iowa and experience how Iowa provides the beef industry with innovation to application.